Home with Mike and Arif. And Arif, one of the benefits of living in our great democratic society is we get to participate in elections quite frequently, in fact. And we do have a couple of them coming up this year, of course. And with those elections, we have lots of promises that come from the candidates, and platforms get put together. And one of the main topics this year is housing and the challenges that are happening in the housing industry. Let's take a look into that, dissect that a little bit, what people are saying, what promises are being made out there. Arif, what do you think?
Yeah, Mike, it's a phenomenal time to be living in. I can't think of a tighter cluster of elections, both recently passed and coming up in the near future. And when you actually break down what is actually happening, it is the you and me, people at home, who are supposed to be voting on our trust, faith, confidence in the everyday average citizen, theoretically, who's putting their name forward to serve. And some of those everyday average citizens might be experts in their field. Oftentimes they're not. But we, the electorate, the voter, is saying, better you than me, and I'm going to keep going about my business, and I expect you to perform and serve our country in my best interest. That's essentially what happens at all three levels of government. Actually, there's more levels of government when you look at school boards and trustees and subcommittees and things like that. But essentially speaking, at the three levels of government, I just want to put that in perspective. We, the electorate, are voting in either experts or everyday citizens to act as experts on our behalf. And you're right, Mike, the hot button issue, I'm not going to say more than anything else, but certainly a hot button issue is housing availability and affordability.
Yeah, it is for all walks of life. Housing, it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. Discussions about real estate and real estate availability and growing prices. But it affects none more than the millennials and the younger generation. And what's interesting is if you look statistically, historically, it's the younger people who are less represented at the polls during an election. But I wonder, because this is such a hot button issue for that younger generation, the housing challenges that we have, is it possible we may see more of them out there at the polls this time around, if we find the party that has the right group of the right plan and platform that's going to address this?
Okay, you had me until that sentence completion. I'm going to suggest to you.
A little wishful?
Yeah, that nobody did that in recent memory, and certainly in recent history, if you will. Nobody did that any better than the current prime minister, who during the Sunny Ways campaign figured out, hey, listen, I'm not going to try and convince only the existing typical voter. I'm going to go after those who have never voted before. And he certainly did so by offering speaking points, if you want to call it bribes, if you want to call it incentives, to attract those voters to come out and support his platform. And he did so in stunning, shocking fashion, very successfully. And like I said, until your sentence completion, in my personal opinion, in terms of it being a productive and successful actual undertaking of delivering on his strategy. However, if you look at it from where we are right now at this moment in time, there are going to be the incumbent parties or incumbent representatives, those who are currently holding the office, who are going to be saying, look how great a job we've done. Times have been tough, but we've pulled through. There have been plenty of opportunities and we've seized upon them, or look at how far we've come together so far. Let's stay the course. And of course, there are going to be those who are saying, hey, listen, it's time for change. Things aren't good. Things have never been worse than they are. And the question will be, who do you believe? Whose lens are we looking for? And the third thing will be the incumbents, those who are already in power, saying, okay, that was good for the last 4 years. The next 4 years, we've got a new plan. And we've adjusted, recalibrated our data, and this is what we suggest that we do for the next 4 years. Well, we met this number of our plans and promises. We now are going to go do this, right?
Well, a number of things have changed and may require a new strategy, but the housing issue, it's been there for a long time and in increasing numbers. let's take a look back to see how we got where we are. Let's do a quick off the top of our heads history of our real estate issues. I mean, if you go back to when we were young boys, for me, that's early 1970s. At that time, at least in Ontario, there was still an adequate supply of new housing coming onto the market that was meeting the demands. And in addition to that, a lot of properties were still being built up until the early 70s, multi-residential apartment complexes, especially around the GTA, to meet the needs of the renter. We got into the 70s and a lot of changes in real estate laws with regards to landlord tenancy and that. A lot of landlords backed away. The incentives that had been provided by government for building rental properties were getting smaller and smaller, and many of them disappearing altogether. So the drive incentive to build those rental properties shifted, and those developers began focusing on building properties for sale. Single home residential was the predominant type of construction throughout Ontario because we had miles and miles of tracts of land. Cities and towns were expanding and expanding. Bring us into the 80s and into the 90s, less and less land availability, more and more focus on environmental concerns with, paving over all of our great farmland in Ontario. And so land became more dear, more precious, drove the price up. Fewer homes were getting built, but we still had a population that was growing faster, increasing faster than the rate of new homes being built. And that all kind of came to a head in the last few years. And certainly we're seeing the repercussions of that now.
Yeah, Mike, well, first of all, thanks for the history lesson. I wasn't around when you were a kid, but no, I was born in the early 70s.
Just a smile on your dad's face that your mother didn't understand at that point, Arif.
So the Canada was a country that welcomed immigrants at the time, and at a rate where Canada wanted and needed highly skilled labor, highly educated people. We were welcoming people in mass numbers, and many, as is still the case today, but many landed and settled in the metropolitan areas like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, for example. But if you look back at what life was like back in the 70s and early 80s, literally nothing was built north of Highway 7, and then maybe you stumbled upon Barrie, and again, that commute to Barrie was like, it was like
early 70s, a population of 26,000 in Barrie.
Yeah. It was unheard of that you were coming into Toronto from Barrie for the most part, certainly not on a daily commute. So it was a time where detached homes, as you said, absolutely were certainly in vogue. It was a time where the Toronto transit system, the TTC subway, was serving everybody it needed to serve, if you will. They had the Yonge line, and they had the portion of the Bloor line, I believe, but the Yonge University line, and it served the masses. It served the people who were there, and it was perfect. And then kind of got forgotten about. But we also were building homes, as you said, when sustainability and renewal of infrastructure wasn't top of mind. We were building homes in an urban sprawl fashion, and it was fine. Nobody thought otherwise about it. And you're absolutely right. Today, things are very different. Today, we're more conscientious of the requirements to have renewal for infrastructure. We're conscientious of the value of every square foot of land, and we're building up instead of just out. So lots of things have changed, but housing affordability being, if you will, gauged and valued by proximity to services or proximity to the GTA, it has absolutely skyrocketed, and there is scarcity. So you're 100% correct, Mike, that the way we think about land and the way we think about real estate and the way we think about our priorities and what our families need in order to call it useful, our needs versus our wants, has changed over the decades for sure.
Dramatically, for sure. And yes, from that 1970s till now, I mean, the solution then to a housing challenge would have been, well, just build more homes. And that's precisely the solution now, build more homes. the strategy to do that is far different, and the controls and restrictions over that demand a certain type of home be built. And one of the big challenges now is, and this is a big challenge for a contributor to the lack of rental inventory, is just with the price points of homes as high as they are, there's no profit built into renting, or less profit, let's put it that way. And in some cases, you might even be having a negative cash flow situation if you were to go out and buy a home today, to purposefully turn around and rent that out. And that's discouraging. So we're seeing fewer and fewer landlords and wannabe landlords coming into it for that reason. At the same time, the need for people to become landlords has increased. You're buying
let's talk about something there, Mike.
That secondary income in more and more instances.
That's just it. Great point. Let's talk about a couple of those things, and I'm sure we'll change up sort of the talking points throughout the show as we go along. But you're right. We were looking at single income families predominantly, a much lower divorce rate predominantly. The income level has gone over a period of time from $1 a day for the average person to $1 an hour for the average person, to approximately $15 an hour, anywhere between 50 and 20. If we're talking about household averages, average incomes of between $40,000 and $80,000 per single or dual income median wage or annual income per family. In the meantime, homes have gone from $30,000 to $60,000 to, we're looking at an average home price of about $900,000 regionally here on a dual income family, with much more in the way of average daily expenses and certainly inflationary costs. Mike, I remember, and just totally by way of an unscientific example, in 1987, I was a lifeguard for the city of North York, making $17.25 an hour.
Yeah.
Fast forward however many years that is, and lifeguards in the city of Barrie and Toronto are probably making about $15 to $17 per hour. And that's just lifeguards. That's not a professional at a higher standard. So, Mike, when we come back from the break, on the other side of the break, what can we talk about? Because certainly there are influences. You talked about the rental availability. We've talked about the housing availability, and there are certain pressures around being a landlord. And I think maybe on the other side of the break, let's also talk about maybe the impact of rent control having been applied and also revised in the last few years. Is that fair?
And in a more general way, I think it's in government, they're looking for solutions to the challenges in the housing industry. They have a choice between opportunity and obstacles, I would say. And too often they focus on the obstacles and forget about creating the opportunity. And let's go into that in a little more depth after the break.
All right, fantastic. Good conversation, and it's gonna only get more vibrant because we're gonna apply some opinions on this. But let's go to break, Mike. We'll be right back with more of Mike and Arif on Hitting Home right after this break. Welcome back. Unlike the other guy who just before the break said the show was actually called Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and welcome back. We're talking about housing. We're talking about the impact of if you will, inflation. We're talking about how times have changed since the 60s and 70s. We're not the same country and province that we were before.
No, population growth.
Population growth, and again, if you will, an attempt to make decisions based on evidence, sound policy based on evidence. But let's be fair to anybody who dares put their name forward to represent their constituents at any level of government. The mess was created, and it wasn't created overnight, and it was created based on a lack of evidence, a lack of data, a lack of good use of said data, maybe some influence based on certain political persuasions or bias. But whichever way you talk about it, the person who comes in tomorrow is inheriting an aggregate of all of the past. And in order to do what's right, you're either maintaining status quo and hoping for the best, or you're going to upset somebody as you try to address the mountain of yesterday's decisions, right?
Too often the temptation's there to look for the short-term solution, not even short-term, the to want to reap the rewards of presenting a quick solution, political rewards that be. And that often leads to, like I said before the break, that creating obstacles. Like too often, like we're looking, okay, we need lots of homes because there's lots of demands for homes. So the focus tends to go to, well, how do we stifle that demand for homes? What can we put in their way that will make people less tempted to want to buy a home? That's not the way you deal with it. I'm sorry. You need to provide the housing for those people, because at the end of the day, they're either going to be owning a home or they're going to be renting a home. They have to live somewhere. And a lot of these obstacles are keeping people in the rental market longer or driving them to the rental market. We have an aging population that's really impacting on the type of housing that is in demand right now with that aging boomer population. And we also have the large millennial population that's coming into the home buying age, and they're driving a lot of the demand. You can't just say, well, we're going to put in stress tests. We're going to penalize landlords out there. We're going to put all these obstacles in the way to try and calm the market. It doesn't address the problem.
Mike, I'm smiling because I never go out of my way to make friends when I have an opinion. And the reality is that when you're going into an election, it is the marketing campaign of marketing campaigns. That's exactly what it is. Because, whether you like it or not, you cannot have an impact or affect change if you don't first get elected. So rule number one that majority of candidates are thinking about is, how do I get myself and or my party elected into government? So it's one thing to be the representative, but it's another thing of whether that representative is in government or in opposition, right? And certainly, is it a majority or minority territory that we're looking at? So step number one that they're thinking about is, how do I get elected? Step number two is, what do I do now that I've been elected? You're right. And so here's the thing: it is a marketing campaign, and nobody wants to be inconvenienced, right? No. So in order to affect some of these changes, you're going to inconvenience somebody. And the question is, do I die? Do I fall on my sword? Do I die on this hill? Or do I do what it takes to stay in power? And it's not fair. It's not nice. I'm not exactly complimenting the society that makes up politicians, but that's a reality.
Well, there are tough choices that have to be made in government, and and there's always going to be winners and losers in the competition to be a homeowner. And we've seen that more and more with multiple bids on homes. I just want to say, and it's not even within the platforms of the various parties, going into this provincial election. I see a lot of the leaders pointing out, and the candidates pointing out, what the problem is and what the end solution should be. We need more homes. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of how we get from A to B, when you look at that, it's a little disappointing. I'm sorry to say, there's not a lot of difference between a lot of the parties in that regard as to how we're going to get there. Our current party, the Conservatives, who have been in there now for 4 years or coming up on 4 years, they've started to address the problem. They've invested more than $19 million, I believe, into revamping the land tribunal to help speed up the process of getting homes from concept to actual shovels in the ground, eliminating red tape. They're putting a lot of pressure on the municipalities to get more involved. But ironically enough, you're hearing from municipalities that they're thinking the province should take on a little more of the dirty work. So there's some discrepancy there as to who should be doing what. A lot of stuff always gets downloaded onto the municipalities, as you full well know.
Yeah, Mike, I'm gonna tell you that I love these conversations. I enjoy this is one of my favorite conversations to have. But it's really comes down to this: is there's optics, there's ideals, there's marketing, as I said, and then there's the truth. And the truth is, you can break 99% of the conversations that you want to have about any one particular item can be whittled down to its most simplest form, and that's the foundational items. We as Canadians, we as Ontarians, and we as residents of Simcoe County, depending on what we're talking about in the level of government, have certain expectations. We have decided as a country and as a province and as a city that we want some form of a healthcare. We want to differentiate ourselves from our peers around the world by having a certain standard of healthcare. Now, some will argue that that standard of healthcare today is not what it used to be. We have decided that we want a certain standard of education. We've decided we want a certain standard of freedoms, of ability to enter into business. So a certain level of capitalism balanced by a certain level of socialism, if you will. We've decided who we are as Canadians. We decided how we want our roads and services to be. At the end of the day, nobody works for free. The government doesn't pay for anything. And all decisions that were made yesterday get paid for today in some way, shape, or form based on how well they were executed. So we can talk at election time about all sorts of ideals, and we can identify problems that shows that we are aware of the problems. But unless we actually discuss things at their most fundamental level and how we're going to address them and how we're going to do things differently today than we did yesterday, no matter
how are we going to get there?
No matter how convenient or fun or acceptable they were yesterday, we have to address things based on numbers.
And I don't want to hear just ideals. I want to hear the nuts and bolts. How will that work? What will it cost? How long will it take? Do we have the resources to get us there?
So, Mike, you talked about...
It's easy enough to throw platitudes out there and say, if we get elected, we're going to build X number of homes. Now, tell me how you're going to do it. It's easy enough to say, promise the moon, but how are you going to deliver on that? That's
Mike, I have an opinion, and my opinion is really simple. Since we're talking about platforms, not only are the provincial politicians going into an election cycle, and we're going to have to deal with that coming up in June, but so are the municipal politicians coming up, I think, towards the end of October. And I'm going to make my statement here really quick and simple. They've all got it wrong. And they've all got it wrong for one reason only, is that they want to point the finger at each other and they want to put the responsibility on each other. But here's the thing: when it comes down to housing availability and housing affordability, as well as those who are living in destitute situations, whether we're talking about the homelessness issue, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about addiction, whether we're talking about people who are having to depend on social services and sort of the impact on healthcare and policing and the court systems and all that stuff, because nothing works independent of one another. No. At the end of the day, any of our municipal politicians locally here or in any other municipality that thinks they're going to address the issue is out of their mind. They don't have a clue what they're talking about. And that's a very bold statement for me to make. And I appreciate that. I realize that. But again, it's not personal. Well, let's break this down to its most basic level. The more any municipality attempts to try and solve housing affordability, housing availability, or homelessness issues, or the price of housing, unless you build a border around your town or your city, you are not going to win this battle, because we start with...
There's downsides to that too.
There are downsides to it, but we can't solve the problem here locally, because if we say, here, we're going to build this one particular tract of housing and we're going to fund it, we're going to support it, we're going to subsidize it with taxpayers' dollars, and we're going to build one house, 100 houses, 1,000 homes, and we're going to address based on data that we have today. Do you not think that there are people living in other municipalities that are saying, I'm moving to Barrie because they've solved the problem? We can't. We cannot solve the problem. It is a problem that must be addressed at a more macro level, and that is either provincially or nationally. I would suggest for certain things, certainly around, if we look at the portfolio that different levels of government are responsible for, if we're going to talk about healthcare and education, certainly at the provincial level. If we're talking about a national housing strategy, well, there is no national market. But if we're going to address homelessness or housing affordability, then we have to keep people where they are and address them and meet them at the needs where they are, not say, hey, City of Barrie taxpayers, we want you to subsidize. And we want, by the way, we want the private industry to cut their own profits and have them work for a loss.
Well, that's the challenge.
And we want the taxpayer locally to pick up that difference. And we want the taxpayer locally to solve that problem. Meanwhile, you're going to see an influx of migration. This isn't hypothetical. We've already seen the influx of migration when everybody was working from home, leaving the GTA and moving to areas surrounding the GTA. It is not going to be solved municipally, period.
No, but all levels of government are needed. All levels of government have their, what they're best at, what they can do. But municipally, the City of Barrie does not build housing. The province can build housing, and there's private sector and public sector housing. We've seen less commitment to public sector housing from the province over the decades. Here's an interesting statistic, though, with regards to private sector housing, is there were more housing starts in 2021 than we've seen in any of the last 30 years. So we're moving in the right direction. But that total number that was built in 2021 still far short of what is actually required here. But
Mike, I went off on a rant. We got to go to break. When we come back from that break, I want to hand the mic back to you to continue on that vein. Let's also talk about what does a housing start.
Thank you, Arif.
What does a housing start mean versus how does that affect affordability? But let's go to break real quick so you have the time to talk about in that vein. So stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on the other side of the break, and I promise I'm going to let Mike talk. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and this segment is brought to you by caffeine, apparently. Before the break, we were talking about housing affordability, housing availability. I went off on my rant about politicians pandering, if you will, or maybe not having all the information before they go out and make lots of proclamations. Mike, you decided to pick that up and talk about the data, and the data is showing that we actually had in 2021 more housing starts than in recent history. Deputy Mayor Barry Ward referenced the fact, though, that there were 19,000 applications still sitting unexecuted upon. Mike, tell us, though, about what does a housing start actually mean, and does that have any impact on affordability in a general sense?
Well, we're producing more homes year over year. Hopefully that trend continues. We're a long way from filling the gap between what is needed and what is becoming available, though. And within that gap, it's not the current homeowners who are trading up, moving from this town to that town. That's of concern. They're the ones that have been driving the market. But as they're driving the market and moving from more expensive municipalities into less expensive municipalities with the means to overbid on homes and drive those prices up, that's pushing more and more people out of the market, first-time buyers especially. And that's where government needs to focus most of their efforts in. I mean, there's no reason for government to create a demand or create a program to build more million-dollar homes. That's not where the challenges are right now. They need to focus on building multi-residential housing, which falls into the more affordable range of housing prices, and they need to do it throughout the province. And they're doing it to some degree. They got to do it more, but they're not doing it themselves. The province is not out there building condominiums, but they need to provide the incentives at an increasing rate to those developers. They need to attract more people to that industry to want to be developers. And they do that through incentives, through transparency in the process, and through, the elimination of red tape. It's such a vague term. I don't like to use it because just streamlining and speeding up the process is a better way to look at it. I mean, you still have all those stopgap measures that I don't think any of them should be totally removed, but you shouldn't go from one process and having to wait 6 months to go to the next step and then another 6 months. We should be able to do this and expedite the process a lot quicker. But as you said as well, as our deputy mayor, who's the acting mayor right now of Barry Ward, pointed out, there were 19,000 units that have been approved for building by the city. The developers, it's in the hands of the developers on when to move. So perhaps that is one thing, and I'd have to look deeper into the different policy platforms of the different parties running and see if anyone's addressing that, because there's 19,000 in Barrie. How many across the province are approved? And let's find out why the developers aren't moving on.
Let's get into that, though, Mike, a little bit. Here's the thing, Mike. Over the last 2 years, the cost of materials skyrocketed. We've had items sitting in containers in the middle of the ocean, and the cost of plywood went up, 700%, or if I'm not mistaken, a 2x4 went up several 100%. So listen, we have had 19,000 housing starts approved, and they've been sitting. And in order listen, nothing's in isolation. We need to stop thinking about.
Are they waiting for prices to go down again?
One can only imagine. It's a question that needs to be asked. That the contract was signed at one level. We saw what happened, by the way, Mike. Let's not forget, 9 months ago or so, we saw what happened when one developer pulled the plug on a certain development and said, listen, if you want this to go forward, you're going to have to give us an extra $100,000. I'm using fictitious numbers. I think they're close. Or we'll give you your deposit back. Now, remember what happens. You give me my deposit back. You may or may not.
That was to the purchasers who had ordered the home.
You may or may not give me a little bit of interest on my deposit, but I can assure you the value of my finished product home would have gone up 42 to 50 to 100%.
Yeah, and as it turns out, what they were asking for was legal.
It totally was legal, absolutely. But again, I'm just trying to say nothing's in isolation. So with 19,000 housing starts, and you see bare shelves at Home Depot or the various hardware stores and lumber mills, et cetera. And it's not just lumber; it's other goods that have been sitting on back order. Maybe there's a reason why there was 19,000 housing starts that didn't happen. Maybe. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm saying maybe, and we need to allow that to be a question that is fairly addressed. So
there's a certain number of speculators who will get a subdivision plan or a project plan approved, which adds value to that property right there. And then they'll just
someone else to build
it and turn around and sell it to the next guy. A lot of that's taking place.
But Mike, you brought up earlier about, for example, rent control, or I think I might have brought up rent control. But when we had rent control, you saw a decrease in the level of interest of investors or landlords to go in and put in that investment, because the government decided that they're only going to have an opportunity for call it a plus minus 1% increase on rents. Meanwhile, inflation might be at 2%. It might be at 1.5%. So for them, it's a losing proposition. They left the market. People stopped building rental accommodation. I don't care what your opinion is, good, bad, or otherwise. From an investor's perspective, it wasn't attractive. What did that create? Mayhem in the rental market. Now you have anything built post 2018 versus anything built before 2018, two different standards. I appreciate the impact that that's having. But in terms of being a builder who we need to attract from government policy to come in and build housing, we also have to look at some other things that are outside that. My opinion, for example, we proved in the last 2 years that you don't need to live in the downtown GTA or any major urban area. You can live in a rural community and you can still do the job, for many, not for all occupations. So why aren't we finding incentives to build outside? So if we found incentives to build in areas like North Bay, Sudbury, Timmins, wherever it might be, Eastern Ontario, Eastern Canada, Western Canada, why aren't we incentivizing people to take the heat off of these pressure cooker of areas where housing prices are going through the roof? We did that in the early years. Why aren't we doing it now? Now that we have the technology, is that not an option to incentivize growth and development for people to consider life outside of the
I think it's being considered at the moment. It's something that's still relatively new, and it's to get government on side with the new concepts seems to take a lot longer than you and I in our ability to embrace it here on the show. But they're at least looking to that. I think
the reality is, Mike,
is this a long-term or a trend?
It's not fair, though, to put the pressure on, and I'm going to use the word fair. Yes, I am. And someone's going to roll their eyes and throw something at the TV. I realize that. But it's not fair to put the pressure on the private sector to say, no, we're going to build at a loss, or we are not going to be able to keep up with market.
No, and they're not going to, and nor should they be expected to.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So the government does have to fill in that gap. And, when it's left to the municipalities, I'll use an example, Elliott Lake, which is, 20 minutes, 30 minutes outside of Sudbury. Not first place on my list that I would look to for retirement, but they decided to build retirement community there. A lot of seniors over the last 20 years, or a number of them, moved to Elliott Lake. This was going to be, cheap retirement. It didn't work out so well for a number of reasons. And so it was a trend in the beginning, and then it quickly died out and the attraction level died. So I think government doesn't want to get involved with anything to a great degree that's going to have a high cost to it and involve, opening up the far reaches of Ontario to, urban
isolation, Mike, isolation. And I think what happened is, I think that was potentially a good idea, but it was before its time. We didn't have broadband to the degree that we did. We didn't have Starlink to the degree that we do. We didn't have drop shipping to the level of popularity that it is now. We didn't have
Amazon,
social media to the level that it is now. So we had people addressing or dealing with isolation, if you will. And I can understand why it failed. It doesn't mean it was a bad idea. It means that there wasn't the resources or the infrastructure.
Today it would be a little more comfortable to implement.
Yeah. So my concern right now, though, is with the level of interest on different levels of government, or different candidates at different levels of government, trying to look like a star moment or a hero moment, saying we're going to solve it ourselves. You're not going to solve it yourselves. We've already proven that you can't. You're not capable of it. So what I would love to see is all of the municipalities, not just one here locally or in any other municipality, but all of the municipalities use their associations of municipalities of Ontario or Canada or large urban mayors caucuses, et cetera. I would like to see these municipalities get together and do what I believe would be a right thing to do, and would be to scream louder, would be to advocate much more effectively for higher levels of government to come to the table. And we need to not be in competition with each other. We've got these buzzwords and trends out there with words like collaboration and words like, similar words, right? And we need to actually do that. Municipalities should not be in competition with each other when it comes to basic needs and services. Every municipality is feeling pressure. Every municipality is working in deficit mode, if you will. They need to bring their voices together and say, we need to stop pitting ourselves against each other, and we need to have true cooperation. And that the only way that we will solve this is when we actually have a plan that serves everybody. Doesn't mean everybody gets exactly equal treatment, but the proper representation for their population, not representation by population, but for their population and what they need.
Yeah. And municipality can be an obstacle oftentimes, and we've seen it here within Barrie. I was out to visit someone. I sold them a house last year. It has a large secondary building at the back of a very deep yard. It sits about 10 feet away from the back fence. We looked at that when she bought a while back, and she said, sometime down the road, I may consider putting in like one of those tiny homes in there. I came over to look yesterday, and no, she's not going to be able to do it. The setback's not enough now, because we had an update to the policy with regards to these homes that basically eliminated the ability to build them in probably 95% of the residential yards in Barrie. It was a schmarmy way, if you ask me, of basically shooting down something that was already approved. You basically create rules that will effectively eliminate the ability to actually build those tiny homes. So that was frustrating because that was something she was looking to do. And I'm sure there's a lot of people, especially in older areas of Barrie with larger lots, who had considered doing that. And it wouldn't have solved the housing shortage issue in Barrie, but it would have done two things. It would have created some additional housing, and it would have created solutions for people in a home who may otherwise have to sell the home because it's just beyond their means to carry, or here's a way to create a secondary income stream from your property. So those challenges and roadblocks that municipalities kind of sneak in a sideways manner, that just leaves me shaking my head all too often.
I agree with you, Mike, and we do have to go to break. So when we come back, let's pick that up, because I mean, there are some ideas in terms of we have to look at things differently, and anybody can point out the problem. What are some of the solutions that we can have? So let's pick up on that in the final segment of the show. And again, we also have a bit of a spotlight that we want to shine a light on something good that's happening locally or been happening locally here. So stay with us for a little bit more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif right on the other side of this break.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. It's an election year. We're talking about some of the things government can and should be doing to address the housing availability and housing affordability challenges that we have here in Ontario. And in preparation for the show, Arif, you and I both, we were doing a little research on looking to see what's in those party platforms of the various parties. And we kind of came to the conclusion that those platforms are incomplete at this point. Hopefully, there's more to be added to those platforms, and we can come back and maybe address some of that when it happens. But right now, what we're seeing is basically they're going, yes, there's a problem. Yes, we're your person, or we're your government party who can solve it. But in terms of the meat inside of all of that, there's not a lot right now.
So I believe it was Tina Turner, but I'm not sure. She said, we don't need another hero, right? We we need people who want to work together, and that's it. And you hear about, certainly in times of crisis, and I'll give credit where credit is due, whether it's on our side of the border or south of the border, when something of great substance or magnitude happens, you do see partisan lines sort of being dropped, not drawn. You see people come together, and you see great things happen, and then it's Wednesday and it's back to normal. And so I'd really like to see all people who have chosen to serve. And that's really the key. It's people who, and it doesn't matter about the paycheck, whether you're at a municipal level, federal or provincial or federal, there's people who've chosen to serve, and people who've chosen to bring their strength forward, choose to cooperate. Now, I realize, talk about ideals. Here we are spending an hour talking about drop your ideals and drop your utopian ideals, and let's get down to business. Maybe that is my ideal, but I believe we talk about it all the time. We talk about cooperation and collaboration and doing what's right. Here's the reality. Fundamentals are never going to change. We have, the way our population ebbs and flows have gone, is that in order for us to maintain a certain level of standard of service or service delivery to our residents that we have come to know, love, and potentially depend on, we will need to see more immigration. Therefore, we will need to see more housing starts just to address immigration. We see people living longer. You've heard me say this over and over again. People are living longer. Therefore, they're not making room for the next generation because they're staying where they are until they're done using it. So we need more houses. And you're right, Mike, 100% correct. There doesn't need to be any more assistance in building $1 million homes. The reality is, though, much like the Sunshine List from the 1980s or whatever year it was, $1 million homes aren't that big of a deal anymore. They're more the norm. And so
scary, but true.
It is scary. So here's the
Yeah.
thing. In order for the young generation you talked about, they're the people who need to be addressed right now. In order for them to get into the market, they're going to need to do something different. And different will mean either driving till you qualify. So we need to make other areas of the country attractive and palatable and viable, or we need to make other programs available for them to pool their resources to get into a home. And that's not the only thing, but those are some things that we've talked about recently.
And I'm going to throw a question out there that we've already answered in part, but I just want to articulate it. And that is, we have within Ontario, just look at Ontario, we've got the Ontario Real Estate Association and its leadership have thrown forward many great ideas, very, very doable, workable ideas that can help to deal with the housing crisis that we have. The federal CREA, they've thrown stuff forward. All the municipalities, they throw their ideas forward. Home builders associations. There's so much good information. If you're sitting behind a desk working for our provincial government, you're on the receiving end of a lot of great information, great ideas, and I don't know what happens. Some of it gets digested, some of it gets turned around and put into practice, but more often than not, at all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal, I am seeing policy that is putting roadblocks in place. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again. Stress tests. I understand the concept of them. They don't solve the housing problem, though. They address a component within the housing industry that's a problem. But, making it tougher for landlords, policies that just make it provide less incentive, not more incentive, to want to be a landlord, to want to be a developer. We see more and more policies. Now they want to put in taxes against out of province landlords. Because by
out of province home buyers,
landlord, you're a bad landlord, you're not going to take care of people. That's just driving people out of the market. There'll be less and less rental property. As all of these things, at the very end, if there's a cost associated with it to penalize the builder, the developer, the landlord, those costs only get passed on to the end consumer. If there's a hurdle or a challenge, it's likely going to result in fewer people involved in the industry and less product as a result. So why do we always go to those things? And I think I know the answer, because it's
Go ahead.
You can do that, and you can then tell the public and the media, look, we care, we're paying attention, and we're doing something. And there's a segment of the population who may not understand how the whole process works, who goes, yeah, stick it to those landlords, stick it to those developers, stick it. No, you don't. That's not a solution, sticking it to them. That's only making the problem that you're frustrated about worse now and even worse going forward.
I fully agree with you, Mike, and I want to appreciate those who are venting and channeling their frustrations, whether it's on social media or amongst their peers and friends, etc. Because the frustration is real.
Oh yeah, for sure it is.
What's real? Reality. Reality is real. The science behind it and the argument and the solution that's being proposed behind it may or may not be accurate, but I get it. And those who are frustrated that it appears like only investors are buying up properties to turn into rentals. Yeah, I mean, they are addressing supply and demand, because if there weren't people buying, or in this case, if there weren't people signing up to be tenants, then those landlords wouldn't be doing it. There wouldn't be landlords who are buying properties sitting with a whole bunch of vacancies. There is a market for them. It may not make you happy. The reality is, though, Mike, that whether we've got a provincial candidate running for re-election, or we've got a provincial candidate or a provincial former elected representative running now for, a municipal running for provincial, or a provincial looking to keep their chair, it doesn't matter. The reality is that all the marketing and talking points saying, hey, listen, I'm the guy, you've got my ear, is not the solution. And by the way, sticking it to the man or being populist in nature is not going to help either. We do need to stop pretending like we're going to address something locally in a small bubble and we're going to come up with a solution. It will not happen. The only solution is at a macro level, and it's going to
Yeah.
require true cooperation. And if we don't think we have a problem now, wait until we actually see the interest rates rise, which they are going to. We've been predicting it for a while. We've been inside this artificially low interest rate environment for over a decade. It will not sustain, and it's going to go up. Mike, we've got something that we want to talk about, though, switching gears a little bit. I don't know if you want to have final words on this before we do that, or if you're ready to go into that next section.
I'll just end by saying I think as we get closer to the provincial election, and as those platforms receive more and more information that we can actually talk about and critique and agree with or disagree with, we should just leave it at that. Maybe we'll revisit this at that later point.
I've enjoyed this, Mike, though, and I think it is a great topic, and I think it's a topic that we're going to give some more attention to and airtime, and I agree with you. Let's listen. We'd love to bring you the details of what the different parties are talking about. They don't know yet, apparently, or they haven't told us yet, and that may be strategy as well.
Not at the level of detail we'd like to see anyways. Yeah.
Agreed 100%. Mike, you came up with an idea, though, that we introduced on our last episode, and it is called the Community Spotlight Award, if I'm not getting it wrong. I'm sorry about that. I apologize, but it's a great idea. And you came up with this idea that you said, let's talk about what's going on in our community, that somebody's doing something
People
right.
making a difference out there.
I'm bringing forward for your consideration today, Mike, not a person per se and not a company either, but I'm bringing forward something that I think really was a community effort in line with today's theme about we'd love to see some more genuine collaboration out there. This is exactly representative of what happens when good people come together, put their egos aside, and they collaborate for the greater good. Okay. And I want to shine a spotlight on a group, on a couple of individuals who became a group, who became a real movement over the last 2 years, certainly during COVID, when all of us were in some form of isolation or lockdown, or really being kept apart from each other. We've only got a few seconds, so I want to get to the punchline. But this is a group that was started by a couple of brothers, I believe, named Jake Matthias and Jordan Matthias, and I believe they got together with a lovely human being, an incredible voice and talent in the community, Kat Chabot, and other people like Luigi Barbaro joined in, and they created something called Barry's Live Music Show. And unless you've been under a rock, you would have heard about them. But if you haven't heard about them, check them out on Facebook. Barry's Live Music Show brought an open mic segment to our living rooms, to our computer screens, to our phone screens over we're running out of time, over the last 2 years. And they just said, let's bring you some light. Let's bring you some music. Let's bring you some entertainment from our basement, from my basement to yours. And they created a movement. 12,800 members are now participating in Barry's Live Music Show. You can find them on Facebook. But not only did they bring entertainment and really lifting our spirits, but they also turned that into a machine where they fundraise for a countless number of organizations in our community.
Very good.
Whether it was supporting cancer survivors or supporting one cause or another, raising, I'm going to believe, over $100,000. I don't know what the actual number is, but $10 at a time, $1 at a time, or $100 at a time, they did it. We're out of time. Mike, thoughts on them?
These are the people we love in our community.
Are they worthy or what?
I think so, for sure.
So this week, I'd love to give them that spotlight. We'll tag them later. And we really want to say thank you for all the blessings that they brought to our community. They made a difference in a lot of people's lives. But with that, Mike, I'll give you the closing comments.
I think we'll just wrap it up with that. It's been a great show, Arif, and I look forward to the next one. You take care and have a good week.
We'll see you then.